Right, this is going to be the second half. We're going to have a total of 3 different recordings that have to do with the bio stuff. Let me get the slides up here for that. There we go. So it was broken in. There, as I said, there were 2 PowerPoint presentations. One of them was real short, and the other one was really overlong. So I'm going to be in the process of breaking those up. In the future, it doesn't really concern you, except that it explains the state of things at the moment. This is the 3rd one that I'm going to be posting, and it's going to be the second half of this longer lecture. And it's going to be on human origins. And so that's where we're headed now. And in order to get there, I got to go through all the other stuff. So, oops, human fossil record. All right. So, yeah, we got through all that stuff. That's where we ended off. Human fossil record. First, I want to point out the definition of a fossil. We've already gotten that in the course before. That's what happens when you have something that was originally organic material, something that was alive, in other words, which falls into certain circumstances in the environment which preserve the form of the thing, but not the organic material. All right, so these are the facts of the fossil record. They're the actual fossils that we're pulling out of the ground. And if you recall the definition of a fact, which we got in the methodology lecture, it's something that exists as part of an external reality and that can be experienced through our senses. All right, so these are the facts that we're talking about in this case. Fossil record consists of fossils. Organic material, falling into circumstances where the form of it can be preserved without preserving the actual organic material. And what it looks like is stuff to the right-hand side here. These are very pretty fossils. Not all of them are fossils, actually. See, they're all examples of skulls, and I use those because they were very recognizable. We could have little busted-up fragments of femur, and people wouldn't know what they were looking at. If you're looking at skulls, you know kind of what it should look like. The one on the top right, that is an anatomically modern human skull, and that's why it's in such good condition. That's probably the actual skull, and I don't know. It's possible it's a cast. I can't tell from this picture; it's too small. But that would explain the condition of it. It looks like bone. Okay, the other ones are either the original fossils or more likely replicas of the fossils, which are going to look pretty much the same in a picture like this. It's not high resolution or anything. They're different species of pre-human ancestors. Right? This one, I believe, is Neanderthal. These 2 darker ones, second column in, are both Australopithecines. This one off on the bottom right is an Australopithecine. This one may actually be Cro-Magnon or something that's anatomically modern. This one's definitely not. I'm saying that's probably a Homo erectus skull. I wouldn't swear to it from this picture by any means. This one probably it could also be Homo erectus too, possibly, maybe not. I don't know. I'd have to look more closely. In any case, I wanted to point out a couple of different things. First of all, it's a bunch of different species. That's why they all look different. The other thing is the coloration on here. And I want to talk briefly about the process of finding these fossils and dealing with them. Right? Usually you don't find just a whole skull like the one on the top right. That's something you hardly ever find preserved. Usually what you find is a bunch of fragments. And you have to kind of fit them together like a 3D jigsaw puzzle. And in order to do that, they use high technology. They get a bunch of cigar boxes and some playground sand. And they fill the cigar boxes with playground sand. They fit the pieces together, they glue them together, and they put them in the sand to dry, because the sand will hold them in place. That's a process I've seen with all kinds of bone in all kinds of labs. It's something well known and done fairly often. Now, these fossils are not common, though. These are extremely rare fossils. There are only so many of them in the world, and we do uncover them at a regular rate, I suppose. And it does add to the collection, but the collection still is not enormous. The vast majority of everything that's happened on Earth, we don't have any record of at all. There's no fossils left over. There's no evidence. We just try to figure out what happened, piece it together based on the fossils that we do have. Right? So in some cases, we have hardly any fossil evidence at all, but it was enough to get some idea of what was going on. And we'll deal with that as they come up. All right. So what's going on up here? I pointed out the coloration of the thing. Some of them have multiple different colors, and that's because they only had fragments. Right, the one in the top left is a good example. Also, the one in the bottom right. The one in the top left was probably pretty fragmentary, and they were missing big chunks. Right, so the lighter colored material that you see is just plaster. They filled in the pieces that they didn't know from the information that they already had. Maybe they had multiple examples of a skull from that species, so they could understand the basic skull anatomy, so they could fill it in with reasonable accuracy. Right, the darker shades on that are represent the fossils that were actually found. So once again, you'd be piecing together a lot of little broken up bones and trying to come up with something that makes some kind of sense. All right, so that's the fossil record. It's not all going to be skulls. Obviously, it's going to be every conceivable bone that might be left behind. All right, so people have to have a really good understanding of this anatomy in order to analyze this stuff, obviously. All right, so when did people first start recognizing fossils? Probably long, long before they started writing it down. If you think about the kinds of fossils that did crop up, things have been dug up in fields, have been eroding out of riverbanks for thousands and thousands of years, and people find them. And before science, before people sort of systematically tried to figure out what they were, people just made up stories about them. And it's arguable that fossil evidence may have been the source of some mythology, like dragons, for example. Maybe they found a dinosaur skull. That's possible in some parts of the world. Maybe they just found a huge tooth and had to explain it. But it's probably not an accident that we have dragon mythology pretty much everywhere in the world, because those fossils were pretty much spread worldwide wherever people are. So, and they may have been discovered thousands of years ago, and the mythology carried down. So, so people have been finding these fossils, but didn't necessarily know how to interpret them. Right. Once science began to develop in the late 17th through the 19th century, into the 20th century, into the present, we gradually began to understand these fossils more and more because we had more and more scientific technique that was coming to bear on them. Evolutionary theory is primarily what we talked about in the first half of this lecture. And that's something that came out of biology, obviously, and it's suited for analyzing how all biological organisms change over time, but also very well suited for analyzing the fossil record. So that was something that was evolving in the context of naturalists studying the world and was applicable to this particular problem. Genetics, another thing, was come up with by monks, some kind of religious figure. I believe he was a monk, Gregor Mendel. Probably people have heard of Mendel, who was trying to understand how to breed better peas, basically, and was charting the progress and basically discovered rudimentary genetics. And that began the whole study of genetics that dominates science, at least dominates biology today. And once we were able to apply that, and that happened relatively recently, not the development of genetics, but the ability to apply it to fossils happened recently because we didn't have the technology to extract DNA from any fossils, which makes sense if you think about the definition of a fossil. Right. I said that there was no organic material left in fossilized material, which is technically true. On the other hand, sometimes fossils can surround preserved DNA. Often teeth will preserve it because they have this really hard enamel around them, so that outer portions can be fossilized. But if you have the technology, you can extract DNA from that. Once people figured out how to do that, how to actually get DNA from some ancient samples, then genetics started playing a much greater role. Right. Also, they could analyze human populations and identify archaic DNA in human populations, which is interesting as well. So genetics has been huge in the last 20 years or so. Before the last 20 years or so, we didn't really have genetics as a tool in analyzing the fossil record. We were reliant more on morphology of bones, so we'll get back to that in a second. I want to talk about the dating techniques first, too. Dating these materials was extremely important. So the ability to put them in some kind of chronological order is what I'm talking about. There at first were relative dating techniques, which also came out of other disciplines. The law of superposition, for example, that's one of them. That's one that made most of the stuff I'm telling you in these lectures, there's a high chance it's going to show up on the exams. Law of superposition is one of those terms that you want to know. Law of superposition came out of geology. And the basic idea is that stuff that's buried more deeply in the ground, provided it has not been disturbed, is usually older than stuff that's buried less deeply in the ground. Right. So that's a relative dating technique. You can dig down through the earth and say, well, this thing was at the bottom, so it's probably older than the thing at the top. We can't say absolutely when it was alive, right, if it's a fossil. we can say it's older. One thing is older than another. It's a relative dating technique. Another relative dating technique is dendrochronology. Dendro has to do with trees, and everybody's probably familiar with the idea that you can saw a tree in half and count the rings to figure out how old it is. You can also tell about growth patterns in different weather cycles and things like that. So if you had a really dry year versus a wet year versus a warm and a cold year, that'll be reflected in the tree ring growth, right? We can use that knowledge with fossilized trees as well. That is, any wood that people may have collected or just happened to be in a site that was being excavated, that was fossilized. We can take multiple samples of wood and we can kind of chart out an entire period and associate that with fossils in the ground. And again, we can get relative dates for these artifacts, not artifacts, fossils. Fossils are different from artifacts. Once again, artifacts are something that's been modified by people. Fossils haven't necessarily been modified by people at all. So I don't want to confuse those two terms. Okay. In any case, both the law of superposition and dendrochronology were available to archaeologists, paleoarchaeologists, before the 20th century. All right, so they could use those to try and understand the chronological relations of artifacts. Sometimes things had been disturbed, and sometimes you had imperfect information. So none of the dates that we come up with are perfect. Now, our ability to date things improved dramatically with the introduction of absolute dating techniques. Absolute dating techniques largely came out of chemistry and physics, and many of them have to do with radioactive decay at the atomic level. And the one that probably people have heard of is carbon-14 dating. It has to do with the regular rate of decay of the carbon atom, the element carbon. And so we know how fast it decays. And so as long as something has carbon in it, which everything that's organic material, everything that was alive did at one point, we can measure the amount of carbon that's left and determine how old it is in an absolute fashion. That is, they'll give you a date. It's something that existed 3,050 years BC plus or minus 150 or something like that. Right. So we can assign an actual date to it. Now, the quality of the sample is going to determine how good the date is. So you'll have these plus or minuses at the end, and sometimes they can be huge. The outside limit for carbon-14 dating, as I recall, is around 50,000 years. I don't know. It may have changed in recent times. You never know. Technology can change things, but as I recall, it was around 50,000 years. Beyond that, you really don't get any. You can't do any carbon-14 dating. So we're going to talk about things that are much older than that. So there are other types of absolute dating, like potassium argon dating, for example, which use different elements which decay more slowly than carbon. And so you can date the rock that's around fossils. It's not dependent on the carbon that was in the fossils originally. You can date elements in the rock around them. So potassium argon dating, this is thermoluminescence, which can give you more absolute dates. Dating techniques came out of other disciplines. So all these other disciplines got sort of co-opted into helping us understand the fossil record. So what is the understanding that we have? Something like this. This is actually an older chart. It's from around 2004, 2005. And believe it or not, a lot of stuff has changed since then. Why would this stuff be changing? You'd think it was chiseled in history or prehistory. It's not, because we have so few examples of the fossils that whenever we uncover anything or get new technology and can better analyze something that we have, people tend to reformulate their understanding of that past. Now, is this an absolute representation of that? Absolutely not. These are people's best guesses as to what was going on based on the fossil evidence at the time. And in a second, I'll show you one from our current textbook, actually the next version of it, the 2019 version or 2020 version. And you'll see that there are some changes in the date ranges, and it's not quite as specific as this one, but you'll see minor changes. For the most part, this is still kind of correct, though. So I left it in there so we can see it. It's also a different format than the one from the textbook, so it's useful for that. All right. Now, I mentioned morphology as the main way of determining species from piles of bones. Before we had genetics, we couldn't really apply genetic DNA analysis to things and figure things out based on the genetics. So through basically up to the year 2000, around 2000, more people were doing genetics, and by 2005, 6, 7, it started to take over basically in the analysis of these things. So before that, they used morphology, which means they looked at the forms of the bones, the shapes of the bones, and so they'd look at a pile of bones, two piles of bones on a table, right? And they look at one and say, this is the same as that one in every respect except for these 6 or 7 different things, right? And based on the importance of those things and how many there are, people would make judgments as to whether they were probably different species or probably the same species. Now, out of that practice came the terms lumper and splitter. Lumpers, that was a term that was given to people who tended to think there was more variation within species than the splitters thought. That is, they looked at the two piles of bones, saw 7 or 8 changes, differences between the two, and said, well, that's really within reason for a species. That doesn't necessarily mean they're separate species. We're going to lump them together into one species. We're going to assume that. Now, splitters would look at the same 2 piles of bones, see all the 6 or 7 changes, and say, no, those changes look pretty critical to me, so I think they were separate species. Now, how would they absolutely know? Well, you have to refer back to our definition of species, right? A group of like organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. At the morphological level, all you're doing is saying whether they're like organisms or not. So you only can really test one of those checkboxes. And still, it's sort of a guess as to whether those changes are that important or not. Right. So how would you actually find out if the 2 piles of bones were the same species? Well, you'd need to get some DNA and clone them, Jurassic Park style. I'm not aware of anybody that's done anything like that, and I don't think that's quite possible at this point. And I don't know if it ever will be, but maybe it will be. Who knows? There are people working on it madly. You'd have to clone them, get them to breed together, and see if their offspring are fertile. Yeah, and to my knowledge, nobody's really anywhere close to doing that. So we can't really say based on the piles of bones themselves. DNA helps us out a lot. So if we can extract DNA from samples from various species that we've defined, that's how the DNA analysis has helped us refine which things were separate species and which things weren't. So probably our guesses are better now, although I would say they still are far from being resolved, and probably never will be resolved. All right. So I wanted to walk through the lumper splitter thing because for the purposes of this class, I'm going to be sort of an intensive lumper. And that means I'm going to lump different species together for the convenience of just giving people the idea of what's going on. If you want to get a really solid understanding of all this stuff and all the details, take 300. I think Anthropology 300. In this course, they deal with human evolution in much more detail. It's a course on this stuff. This is a cultural anthropology course. I'm just giving you a taste of it. All right, so how am I going to lump these things? I'm going to talk about Australopithecines only at the genus level. So you'll notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different species in the genus Australopithecus. I should point out that Australopithecus means southern ape because that's where they were found in the southern part of Africa, and they were more ape-like than human-like, even though they were bipedal. Bipedal means they walk upright on 2 legs. All right, so Austral means southern, Pithecus means ape. So the genus Australopithecus technically means southern ape. It's ape-like creatures that walk upright and are considered to be in the human line, more or less. Right. So we have 4 different species represented on this particular chart. I'm only going to talk about, I'm going to use Australopithecus afarensis as an example, because that's one that's been included in the human line directly for a long period of time, although there may be an argument about that at this point as well. There are some that are missing that I know could be included on here as well. But we're going to use afarensis as our example of Australopithecines. Right, and we're just going to talk about, as I said, Australopithecus at the genus level. So we're not going to talk about, we'll use afarensis as an example, but that's it. We're not going to, I'm not going to ask you to identify afarensis. Right, now there are a number of other members of the genus Homo on the chart. We got Homo rudolfensis, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Erectus, Floresiensis, heidelbergensis, Homo sapiens, that's us, and Homo neanderthalensis, which has been a great deal of argument about. And actually, those are the parts that have changed the most since this chart was made. All right. Most of the changes have been down in this area in terms of what we understand. Some of the things, like the dates for some of them, have been pushed back. Homo habilis, has been given a longer time frame, considerably longer. That's been extended back quite a lot. and forward a bit too, as I recall. But we'll see when we see the other chart. All right. So for our purposes, we're gonna, as I said, lump some of these together. Meaning we're gonna talk about a type example. We're gonna talk about Homo habilis. So we'll talk about Australopithecines at the genus level. We'll talk about Homo habilis at the species level, and we'll, with the understanding that maybe some Australopithecines are lumped in there. Maybe a Rudolfensis is kind of lumped in there as well, and some ergasters, just in terms of what they were like. But we're going to use Homo habilis as the type example. Excuse me, I'm dying here. All right. Likewise, we're going to skip to Homo erectus. That's going to be the next one that we're going to look at, and understanding that maybe some ergasters are lumped in, and some Heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis developed directly out of erectus. We're not going to deal with them individually, but that was a sort of a bridge species into our own Homo sapiens and other similar species that existed, archaic versions. So again, this is where a lot of the discrepancy is coming into play. So we'll deal with that as it arises. All right, so we're going to talk about Australopithecines. We're going to talk about Homo habilis. We're going to talk about Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. Those are the four major ones that we're going to talk about. We may touch on some of these other ones as we go by. All right. There is the... Excuse me. Having a rough day. All right, this one was taken directly from your textbook. Right, it's got millions of years ago across the top, and so 2.5 is 2.5 million years ago. 0.5 million years ago is 500,000 years ago. Right, and presence all the way to the right. You'll notice that Homo sapiens, again, is down in the same location it was in the other chart. It's relatively short compared to the other ones. I said Homo habilis got extended back. Before we had it stopping before the 2.5 million mark. Here it's stretched back to like 2.8 million years ago. Rudolfensis is shorter, and completely overlaps Homo habilis. Habilis overlaps erectus for a number of years, which he didn't quite do on the other chart. Erectus goes for at least as long as habilis. So those were both tremendously successful species. Right, they lived for a long, long time relative to Homo sapiens, who's only been around a little time by comparison. And they're pushing on this, they're pushing Homo sapiens back to about 300,000 years. Anything we could potentially call our species, those would be what were traditionally termed archaic Homo sapiens. And a lot of these other groups that you see, sorry, I'm having a rough time. A lot of these other groups you see would be lumped in with archaic Homo sapiens 5 or 10 years ago. Neanderthals were considered to be a member of the archaic Homo sapiens group. This was after DNA evidence revealed that there was Neanderthal DNA in modern human populations, which there is. And before that, there was argument about whether humans and ancient archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthals could interbreed. Well, the DNA evidence kind of solved that. But then they kind of walked that back and said, well, maybe we'll go back to calling them Homo neanderthalensis. They were really very different. The time frame suggests that maybe it was more hybridization across the two different groups, and they were different species, and so that sometimes that's possible, which sort of blows our definition of species. But you can assume that anything we learn in this class, if you start digging into it at the biological level, you go and get a degree in biology and study it in graduate school, you're going to find a lot more detail and a lot more difficult contradiction going on. We don't understand the natural world perfectly. We're trying to sort it out as we go. So everything gets deeper when you investigate it, right? The Denisovans, that's another group that's related to Neanderthals. The idea is that they split off. We all split off from Heidelbergensis at some point over 500,000 years ago, and then Neanderthals and Denisovans split a little bit later than the split of archaic Homo sapiens. As I said, both Neanderthals and Denisovans would have been considered archaic Homo sapiens not that long ago. All right, so this is all new discussion that's gone on. Excuse me. You can still make the argument. There still are people who believe that, right, in the community. So not just random people in the street, scientists who study this sort of thing. So the thing about the Denisovans is we have hardly any fossil evidence they existed. Neanderthals, we have quite a few samples. And they were always seen as an archaic Homo sapiens group that lived alongside modern Homo sapiens for an extraordinarily long time. There was the assumption that there were a bunch of archaic groups that we hadn't identified, and Neanderthals just happened to be one that lived longer than the other ones. All right. But we do have a bunch of different samples of Neanderthal fossils. Denisovans, we have, I think, we've got some parts of a finger bone, maybe 2 finger bones, and maybe a bit of skull, and I think 1 tooth. And that's it. Like, literally, you could fit all of the fossils for Denisovans in a teacup. It's hardly anything. But what we did find, we were able to extract DNA from. And so we were able to say a whole lot about Denisovans that we don't know from actual fossils. We know from the DNA we could extract from only a couple of fossils. I think the tooth yielded some, maybe the finger yielded a little bit of analyzable DNA as well. In any case, if you go back 20 years, they didn't even know what they were. These are relatively recent discoveries, but now they know quite a lot because they've been able to sequence the entire genome from that. All right, so this is a more recent chart. As you can see, it's not that different. Right, it's not that different. Everything's more or less in the same place. It's more different around the edges in terms of how they fit things together. So, all right. So, once again, these are the 4. We're being massive lumpers here, and these are the 4 different categories that we're going to focus on. Australopithecines is the genus level. We're around roughly from 4.5 million years ago to 2 million years ago. Again, you're going to find more specific dates. These are sort of, big picture dates. You may find different ones in different textbooks too, because people disagree on how things are classified. All right, so Homo habilis around from roughly 2.8 million years ago to 1.5. That is the pushback date. Homo erectus around 1.9 million years, 200,000 years ago. That's including some Heidelbergensis in there. I think your book's eliminating it now to around 500,000 years ago. And Homo sapiens at the earliest thing we could possibly call Homo sapiens, if we include in all those other archaic populations that have now been kind of separated out as their own species, maybe we could push back to 500,000, 600,000 years. In terms of absolutely anatomically modern human, and your book abbreviates those as AMH, anatomically modern human, we're going to push that to about 300,000 years ago. Right. And in terms of behaviorally modern humans, that is humans that acted kind of like us, recognizably like us, we're looking at within the last 100 years. I think the book's setting it around 80,000 years and 40,000 years for really complex behavior, like cave paintings and things like that started to show up. There's sort of an explosion of creativity around that time. And certainly then things accelerated rapidly from 10,000 years ago to present, because of domestication, settling in cities, and large populations, and all that. So this is basically the breakdown we're going to look at. Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens. We'll go through each one of them individually. Australopithecines, as I said before, stands for southern apes because of where it was discovered. The principal investigator who discovers something for the first time is the one that gets to name it as a rule. All right, so if you organized the study, got the study funded, organized all the people and got them in the field and kicked the whole thing off, and you're running the thing from day to day, you're the principal investigator. And they abbreviate that PI, principal investigator. And if you discover something that nobody's ever seen before, you get to name it. So that's where these names come from. A lot of times they are descriptive, as in the case of Australopithecines. Not descriptive in that case of the individual, but the place. That's the other thing you often see as place names. This one's kind of in between. It describes the individual and the place. Southern ape is in the southern part of Africa, and ape-like, except that it was bipedal. It was walking upright. Excuse me. Afarensis, which I said was the example that we're using. This is an example of Australopithecus afarensis reconstructed, a scientific drawing. I believe that's also a place name. Right, so it's the place in South Africa where they found them originally. Okay, so chronology was 4.5 million to 2 million years ago. And again, there were multiple species. We're just talking about this at the genus level. They had a small cranial capacity, and we'll see that when we look at the skull on the next slide. Small cranial capacity. Cranial capacity is a term that refers to the volume of space inside a skull, inside the cranium, where the brain goes. We can't measure their brains because the soft tissue didn't survive. Right, but we can measure the space inside the skull where the brain goes, get some idea of relative brain size. So relative to modern humans, they had tiny brains. small cranial capacity. Relative to a chimpanzee, I think it's in the same ballpark. The brain's about the same size as a chimpanzee. Behavior more or less ape-like, like a chimpanzee. They were bipedal, and here I want to give you a little bit of background on modes of locomotion. That means ways of getting around, in terms of biology. We're going to talk about different modes of locomotion. Bipedalism is a mode of locomotion. You might say that these individuals had bipedal locomotion, and that means they walk upright on two legs. Bi means two, pedal means feet. Dogs and horses and rhinoceroses and whatever else is walking around on 4 feet is quadrupedal locomotion. Quadrupedal. Right, so quadrupeds, obviously, you call them quadrupeds. Quadrupeds are a lot faster on the ground than bipeds. Bipeds can walk long distances using minimal energy, but they're not the fastest things running around out there by any means. So this was a unique sort of adaptation that we saw. And it's from a group of apes that had lived in jungles. And in jungles, they were not bipedal, right? Those original ape populations. They had other means of locomotion, particularly brachiation. Brachiation, B-R-A-C-H-I-A-T-I-O-N, brachiation, which refers to swinging through trees arm over arm. And that's why we can move we have this ball joint in our shoulder that allows us to rotate our arm 360 degrees because of our distant past in which we came from populations that brachiated. Now, when brachiators get on the ground, because they're brachiators, they have long arms and short legs. So when they get on the ground, they're not quadrupedal, they're not quite bipedal. They do something called knuckle walking. Knuckle, like the knuckles on your fist. Knuckle walking. This is what they do, what they call it when they walk in a stooped over fashion. They're propelling themselves along with their short little back legs and pulling themselves along by their knuckles on the ground with their arms. Again, their arms much longer than their legs. So they call it knuckle walking in general. There's a variant called palm walking, which is associated with orangutans just because they place their hands differently on the ground when they do it. But they do the same thing. They brachiate in the trees and they palm walk on the ground. Right, so those are the modes of locomotion that we're going to deal with in class. Bipedalism, quadrupedalism, brachiation, and knuckle walking. Those are the ones that are relevant, more or less, in talking about human evolution or pre-human evolution. Okay, so behavior overall is ape-like. Once again, small cranial capacity in line with more or less a chimpanzee. It's very likely that their behavior was kind of like a chimpanzee, except one that had been kicked out of the forest. Excuse me, and was living on grasslands out on the savannah. Why were they bipedal? There had to be a selective pressure, right? Think about the process of evolution by natural selection that we talked about in the previous video. It had to be selective pressure in order to get them to do that. They came from brachiating, knuckle walking animals that lived in forests and were pushed out onto the plains for whatever reason. Probably got too crowded in there, so they started exploiting another niche, going out onto the grasslands. There are a number of hypotheses as to why bipedalism developed. It frees up the hands for one. That's one thing. It allows you to use tools, which eventually they do. If they were out on grasslands, they wouldn't need to brachiate anymore, so you wouldn't have to have specialized arms for brachiation. So you might as well stand up, and also you can see potentially over the grass. All right, you may have grass that's growing up, 3, 4, 5 feet high. So to be able to get up over that, you might have done better to stand up. They might have been able to spot birds that were circling dead animals or things that they could scavenge. There's a very high likelihood that Australopithecines were scavenging a lot out in this savanna environment. Right? Apes do, particularly chimpanzees, do hunt. People think of them as vegetarians, and they're largely vegetarians, but they do hunt and eat meat in the jungle, which is a horrendous activity to witness. If you've seen a group of chimpanzees going after something, it's not any fun at all. But so there's a good chance these guys were eating meat when they came out to a certain extent, and they probably found more meat sources of food on the savannah than lacking all of the tree variation that was in the jungle. Savannah being grasslands, there aren't a lot of trees, so brachiation is basically impossible. So walking upright on 2 legs might have been the most natural adaptation to that. And by that I mean the most successful strategy. The one that allowed you to survive, be healthy, and reproduce the most. That's in biological terms, reproduction is success. If you can pass on your traits, then you win. If you don't, then you lose. You're not really relevant to the evolutionary process. All right. So most likely, ape-like behavior, most likely scavenging out on the savannas. Were they able to compete with the large predators that were out there directly? No, not at all. I mean, everything was bigger and stronger and faster and meaner than them. There were lions out there of various sorts, and large cats, other hyenids, and other kinds of large predators. And they couldn't win a fight with any of them necessarily, but maybe they could outsmart them. Right, so maybe they could pick time their visits to the kills just right, and get some sustenance from that. Just walk in there and chop some stuff off and take it off. Maybe they could outsmart them in other ways. We have to bear in mind that these guys were part of the landscape, and they were also prey animals too. There was a type of leopard on the savanna that coexisted with Australopithecines and maybe some early Homo habilis as well, that had canines, those big fang-like teeth in the front, that were spaced apart about the same width as the eye sockets in coexisting species of Australopithecus. Right, so it usually, and that's something that happens in predator-prey relationships a lot. If they go on for long periods of time, then one will evolve to better predate on the other one. So the idea is these ones were sneaking up behind them and grabbing them right over their head, hooking right into their eye sockets. It's fairly gruesome, but anyway, there's a high probability that they were being preyed on as well by the large cats. So they had to get smarter. That's one of the things that happened. Let's see, moving on, let's look at some of these. All right, I had a student once ask for more, variable representations of the species in question. Specifically, it was a female student who asked why all those scientific drawings were male. I don't know how she necessarily thought they were male in the first place. I wouldn't be able to tell from that picture, but that was a question. My response was to go looking for other representations. So this one off to the bottom left here was meant to be specifically a female representation of Australopithecus afarensis. It was done by an artist of sorts who had very little anatomical knowledge, and it came out looking like some kind of a Sasquatch. That's not a very helpful example. It was meant to be a female Australopithecine, so I put it in there. This is a better one, better effort, and again, meant to be specifically a female example of Australopithecus afarensis. This person had maybe a little bit better anatomical knowledge and a little bit better artistic skill, but not that much better. Let's see, this is a scientific drawing that I was using originally. Scientific drawings usually are pretty accurate, obviously, because they have good anatomical knowledge and know what they're trying to draw. They're also oriented in the same direction and at the same scale as other drawings, usually for comparative purposes. So they're the most convenient to work with, for sure, if you're trying to understand something about the species. Or any organism. All right, we've got a skull, or more accurately, castings of a fossilized skull fragments and put together of Australopithecus afarensis, off to the right here. A couple things I want to point out that are distinct from modern human skulls, or very different from modern human skulls. One is that the brain is really small. As I mentioned, they're in the ballpark of a chimpanzee, not a human. If you're looking at a human skull, there would be a big ballooning up of this frontal. I hit the button again. All right, a big ballooning up of the frontal lobe, and the bone would literally go kind of straight up from the eyes and back. This is what they call a sloping forehead, indicating that there's no frontal area of the brain really to speak of. There is, but it's minimal. Right, another thing that we could see if we could turn this and look at it from the top down is something called postorbital constriction. It's P-O-S-T orbital, O-R-B-I-T-A-L, constriction, postorbital constriction. Literally, they're talking about the eye orbits, and constriction is sort of pinching together. All right, so if you looked at it from the top, you'd see that behind the eyes, which flare out in the front, the eye sockets, there's this pinch in the front of the brain. All right, so there's really not much in the way of brain there at all. You got your eyes where brain might be. There's also this big flaring zygomatic arch. That's this arch that goes across here, and you can see that it's hollow behind there, and it's basically a muscle attachment up here. There's a big muscle that goes down to power these enormous jaws. All right, another thing that we notice is different is they have much bigger jaws, bigger teeth relative to the rest of their head than a fully modern human by a large margin. All right. And so two of the trends that we see in pre-human evolution, from Australopithecus to fully modern humans, are increase in brain size, so they get larger brains, they get smarter, and decrease in jaws and dentition. Right, so we see a reduction in the jaws and dentition, along with that a reduction in what they call facial prognathism. That's facial, F-A-C-I-A-L. New word, prognathism, P-R-O-G-N-A-T-H-I-S-M, facial prognathism. That's the degree to which the jaw and the nasal area, snout in other words, sticks out from the plane of the face, the flat part of the face. Right, so you can see this one sticks out a fair amount. It's got a fair amount of facial prognathism. We see that gradually reduce as the jaws and teeth become less important. Why do they become less important? As our brains get bigger, we can develop more tools and more intelligent strategies to process things in nature, so we rely less on our natural tools, teeth, as our primary tool. Right, so as our brains get bigger, we see a reduction in jaws and teeth. Smaller jaws, smaller teeth, because we don't need to rely on them as much. We develop tools. We can do all of our cutting with that. We can smash things with that. We can eventually make fires. So that helps to make digestion and processing of food much easier. It's easier to eat a cooked steak than it is to eat a raw steak, by far. So, larger brain, more complex behavior, reduction in jaws and dentition. So we got tools. We got smarter strategies. All right. See if there's anything else I'm leaving out there. No, those are the major things I wanted to point out here. All right. This is a different form of reconstruction. It's called a forensic reconstruction, and it's really the best sort of reconstruction that we could possibly hope for. It's done by people with a particular skill set. They have good anatomical knowledge of whatever species that they're working with, and they have artistic ability to sculpt basically muscle based on what they understand the muscle should be, looking at the contours of the skull onto a skull. Now, this was developed in a forensic context, so they were dealing with fully modern humans, and in those cases, the people who could do this, they could find a skull, say it had been somebody who was missing for 40 years, and they could do the forensic reconstruction, basically sculpt muscle back onto the thing, and people who knew the person when the person was alive, in many cases, could recognize the face. That's how good this reconstruction is. Now, we don't understand Australopithecine skulls as well as we understand human skulls, but we can safely say that this is the best reconstruction we have access to at this point. Right. So in class, I asked people if that's starting to look human. Not really, except for the eyes, which they went out of their way to make look human. Those are human form eyes. If you look at a chimpanzee's eyes, they don't look like that. Otherwise, you could put this right next to an orangutan, and probably a male orangutan, and it'd look very similar. Average person probably couldn't tell the difference. It is different, but not that different. Okay, so that's pretty much what they look like. Not looking human, looking ape-like, acting ape-like, small brains like apes, walking upright like a person, bipedal locomotion. All right. Relatively small, by the way, not big, more like a chimpanzee than a human, around 4 feet. Homo habilis is in the ballpark of the same size. Right? Homo habilis, the term homo, the genus term, means man or person. It comes from the Latin term homo, which means man or person, and not the Greek term, which means the same. So you'll find the English words with the roots in the Greek and roots in the Latin. This one's in the Latin. So man or person, and habilis means handy. So literally this means handyman. And the reason for that is that it's the first member of the genus Homo to use stone tools. And you see a little stone tool in the hand of this scientific drawing. Right there. Now, it turns out that's not the first in the human line to use stone tools, because later on they found out that some of the later Australopithecines also used stone tools that were very similar to the ones that Homo habilis made, and that wasn't surprising at all. And that's because Homo habilis evolved out of populations of Australopithecines. Right, so that's not shocking by any means. Still, they got the name Homo habilis, which means handyman. First member of the genus Homo to use stone tools, which is true. Larger cranial capacity. We mostly see the difference in the rear part of the skull. So it's not that frontal area that's being developed, and that's where we do most of our complex thinking. The brain is getting bigger and allows more processing, and they're capable of more creative solutions than, say, chimpanzees or Australopithecines before them overall. Chronology, 2.8 million to 1.5 million years ago. Again, that was pushed back a little bit from what it was several years ago with new discoveries. Okay, so larger cranial capacity, got that. Relatively small stature. I want to talk a little bit about simple stone tool use. All right, we want to get the term Oldowan tradition, Oldowan, Oldowan tradition. That is the tradition of stone tool manufacture that's associated with Homo habilis. It is a core flake technology. That's hyphenated, CORE hyphen flake, FLAKE. That means they take a big rock, they start knocking flakes off of it to form like small cutting tools like razor blades. And they end up with a big core tool, which has usually a point on one end by the time they get done knocking flakes off of it. And so it's good for smashing through things and doing big work, while you've got the small little razor blade type things for small cutting, for fine cutting. So that is a core flake technology. It's called the Oldowan tradition, associated with Homo habilis. There's not a great deal of regularity in this. There's variability across all the different Homo habilis tools that have been recovered. I do like to point out in class and spend some time talking about this. There's about the fact that they had to think a lot in order to get to the point of making stone tools. It's more complicated than you might think, unless you've tried to do it yourself. First of all, you have to recognize what kinds of materials can be worked in that fashion. Right? I gave the term conchoidal in class, which is a characteristic of fracture that you find in the appropriate kinds of materials. That's conchoidal, conchoidal fracture. It means literally fracturing in the form of a cone. And so when you, and it happens in tightly grained rocks, also glass fractures conchoidally and has all the properties that you'd be looking for in a stone tool, except durability. Right? There's naturally occurring glass, volcanic glass specifically, I'm thinking of, called obsidian, which probably a lot of you have heard of. It's a nice looking glass. It looks black sometimes if you just see it from far away, but if you hold it up to the light, you can see through it. It's kind of purple and translucent. It's volcanic glass. It's called obsidian, and that's something that was traded, far and wide in the ancient world among modern humans later on. But it's also something that might have been run across by species before us. It has exactly the properties you look for. It fractures conchoidally. It's a very tight grained structure. Other types of stone that fracture in a similar sort of manner are chert, rhyolite, and flint. Probably people have heard of flint knapping. That's FLINT is the stone, and KNAPPING refers to flaking the stone, like knocking flakes off of it and using it to form the stone into a useful tool. That's knapping. Excuse me. I put up a video along with this. It shows Nick Toth, a well-known archaeologist, doing some flint knapping. I think he demonstrates the Oldowan and the Acheulean traditions, as I recall. So if you want to look at that, it's fine. It might have come from, I don't know if it came from National Geographic or somewhere else, but it was a well-known archaeologist doing it. All right, so the simple stone tool use wasn't all that simple. They had to be able to locate the correct materials that could be worked. They had to understand, they had to visualize the thing that they wanted to create and figure out how to mechanically make that happen. All right, so that was a fairly complex thing. That's something I've tried before, and it's actually quite difficult to do, even if you know what you're doing. I've read books on it and seen people demonstrate it, and still, it's hard. It's a skill that you have to master. It takes time and effort to try and become proficient in that. So it's not a simple thing that they had worked out. It's much more complex than you would think. The other thing that's important about it is it gave them access to new food sources. We said that Australopithecines were largely scavenging out on the savannah, right? So they were used to sort of looting the kills that had been left behind by other larger, more powerful animals. This simple toolkit allowed these relatively small individuals to break into the long bones of large pachyderms, which is something that often went to waste on the savannah because the carnivores that were out there could kill the things, they could eat the things, they could eat pretty much everything in the carcass, but they could not break through those long bones. The long bones I'm talking about like femurs and tibias and fibulas, leg bones. So on the larger pachyderm, I'm talking about elephants, rhinoceros, and hippopotamus, those kinds of things. So a lot of that stuff was going to waste. What was going to waste? Exactly the marrow that was inside the bones. Yeah, this is a very rich source of protein. So you crack open the bones, there's marrow in there, you can eat that, and it's got a huge amount of protein in it. So it was a huge protein source that Homo habilis got exposed to. And from that point forward, it's generally understood that there was feedback between the development of larger brains and access to eating more meat. right? Access to more animal protein. So the more people ate meat, the more they could fuel these large, expensive organs called the brain in your head, and the larger and more complex their brain got, the more efficient they were at getting sources of meat. Right? So there's feedback between the two. That is, they reciprocally enforce one another. Right? So it was, eating more meat was a large factor in us getting smarter, in other words, in these early stages. And I say us, members of the same genus, our ancestors, distant ancestors. All right, so not only was it a complex breakthrough that took some intelligence to sort out, it led to a sort of feedback that went on for a long period of time that maybe even kicked off this accelerated brain growth in members of the genus Homo. All right, so Homo habilis. Here are some representations. We've got our scientific representation in the top left. And we've got an artist drawing that was meant to be a female representation, to a reasonable understanding of anatomy, but it was made especially to look very human. We've got our skull off to the upper right-hand corner, and you'll see that there's a little bit of a flaring up of the frontal area of the brain. Most of the expansion is still in the back. It did grow a little bit in the frontal area, but so there'd be a little bit less, significantly less post-orbital constriction if we looked at it from the top than we would see in Australopithecines. We've got much more flaring in the back of the brain. There's much more brain back there than there is in Australopithecines. Still not comparable to modern humans by any stretch. It's much more smaller. And again, the frontal area is not really that well developed. As a result, you have protruding supraorbital ridges, which you had in Australopithecus as well. I didn't point out exactly because it seemed like it was just part of the eye socket. It didn't seem to stick out because there wasn't any brain behind it. There wasn't any skull behind it, really. In this case, there is that frontal section of the skull is beginning to rise up. So we have the formation of supraorbital ridges. Supraorbital means above the eye orbits, and ridges of bone. Supraorbital ridge, those big eyebrow bones. There's a tiny remnant of those left in modern humans, generally in male specimens. Right. So usually, not always, but usually, you can sex a skull by a number of traits. One of them is the supraorbital ridges. There's a little bit of a remnant there in male skulls, usually, not usually in female skulls. Usually it's totally smooth in female skulls. Also, post-occipital protuberance. If you look feel on the back of your head, most of the time on male skulls, there's a little knot there, in the center, in the back at the base of your skull. And that's sort of a remnant. In Neanderthal populations, it's an occipital bun. It's a much bigger chunk of bone. In any case, that's often helps to distinguish male from female skulls, although it's not 100% correct. There are some female skulls that have it, some males that don't. Same with the supraorbital ridges. All right. The ridges are reduced largely because that bone's being repurposed as the frontal area of the brain grows and the skull expands upward to accommodate it. All right, so as that frontal area develops, supraorbital ridges are reduced. So they're reduced compared to the previous specimens, the Australopithecines, but not compared to the next ones necessarily. And again, we have to think proportionally because the next species are going to be much bigger. They're going to have bigger heads, and so the ridges will look bigger, but they're not in proportion necessarily to the rest of the skull. All right, reduction in jaws and dentition as well. We're missing the mandible here. We still have the maxillary portion of the jaw. I keep hitting that button, don't I? All right. See the top part of the jaw. This is the maxilla, this part of the face, maxillary bones. And that's the maxillary portion of the jaw. The mandible is the part that stretches underneath the actual jawbone, and that's missing. So if we did have that and we could compare it with a fully modern human skull, it seemed like it had much bigger jaws and teeth. But if we compared it with an Australopithecine, it'd have smaller jaws and teeth. So gradual reduction in jaws and dentition, increase in brain size, and complex behavior. Also bipedalism. That's another trend in human evolution, which I didn't mention before. increased efficiency of bipedalism. And that's something we can't tell from the skull. That's why I didn't think to say it before. We'd have to have the pelvic bones, look at the pelvic girdle, the shape of that, and articulation of bones. And, look at the long bones, femur, tibia, fibula, and the bones of the feet. And if we look at all of those, we can tell how efficient bipedalism was for that individual. So more efficient bipedalism is another trend that we see, along with reduction in jaws and dentition and increase in brain size and complex behavior. All right, this is our forensic reconstruction. We're getting definitely closer to human, but we're still not quite there. If you saw one of these running around, you'd do a double take for sure. Yeah, it's looking more ape-like than human-like by far. The behavior is definitely going to be more ape-like by our standards. All right, so we're still not getting in the ballpark of human exactly. This has been an exaggeration, this artist's sample. All right, Homo erectus. This next one, 1.9 million years ago. Again, on the outside of 200,000 years ago. That's if we lump in some Heidelbergensas. Probably it's more like 500,000 years ago, where we stop seeing them as much and start seeing Heidelbergensas. Physical attributes: larger cranial capacity, both absolutely and proportionally. Absolutely, I mean they're larger individuals. These bodies can get as big as 6 feet, so they can certainly overlap, maybe even be bigger than some of the human range, the modern human range. Modern human range on average, by the way, worldwide, looking at women at around 5'2", men at around 5'8", average coming in around 5'5". For the United States, it's a little bit taller largely because of access to nutrition, and some of it might have to do with population genetics as well. But in the United States, we're looking at more like 5'4" for average for women and 5'10" for men. And there are obviously people running around that are taller than that, but on average, if you just average them all out, that's more or less what you get. So these guys were at least our size, maybe bigger. And because they were bigger, they had larger heads. Larger heads mean larger brains. Brain size is proportional to body size for the most part. So they're going to have absolutely larger brains than Homo habilis, but they're also going to have relatively larger brains, proportionally larger brains, meaning that there's more brain compared to the size of the head. All right, so both absolutely and relatively larger brains, larger cranial capacity. Along with that, we get a lot of complex behavior that we didn't see with Homo habilis or Australopithecines. That toolkit, the Aldebaran toolkit that Homo habilis had, is now refined, and it's called the Acheulean tradition, Acheulian, Acheulean tradition, and associated with Homo erectus. Uniformity means it's the same wherever you find it, and one of the signature pieces in this new and improved core flake technology, still a core flake technology, it's just not the Aldebaran tradition, it's the Acheulean tradition. The core tool has been refined to something called a teardrop-shaped hand axe. Right, and everybody knows what a teardrop shape is. Right, it's kind of like an axe head, but with a point on one end. So if you've ever seen an axe, you've seen it probably hafted. Hafting means it has a handle. If you take the head off the handle, and you sort of pound the pole of it, which is the square part of the axe on the wrong side of it, to a point, it would look like this teardrop-shaped hand axe. And they call it a hand axe because that'll fit right into your hand, not coincidentally, and you can use your arm as the lever to chop with the blade of the axe. You can flip it over, put a skin over the blade, and use the pointed part of the axe to smash through stuff, and you've got basically two tools in one. And it's a regular form that we see across the Homo erectus landscape. Everywhere we find Homo erectus, we find teardrop-shaped hand axes with one exception, and that is below the line in Asia where bamboo grows. And through ethnoarchaeology, which is trying to look at living populations to understand archaeological problems, it's ethnoarchaeology, the suggestion has been put forward that Homo erectus that were living below the bamboo line could replicate all of the functionality of stone toolkits, their stone toolkit, with bamboo tools. It's a very useful plant. You can make all kinds of stuff out of it. So you can get everything accomplished with that. You wouldn't necessarily need to make stone tools. Based on studying modern people who live in those areas. All right, so uniformity in tools with that one exception. Everywhere we found them, basically, we found the same toolkit, and so they had an idea. They didn't just have an idea of the kind of tool they wanted to make. They knew exactly what they wanted it to be, and made it the same everywhere they were. Right? So that's evidence of more complex thinking. We also see a controlled use of fire associated with Homo erectus. All of which is pointing toward that last element there, which we'll talk about in a second. Controlled use of fire. That's carefully phrased because they don't know if they had the ability to make fire. You can find fire in nature. If you're out on the savannah in Africa or any other place, lightning strikes during the dry season, starts a fire. And all the other animals run away from that because they don't want any part of it. These ones, maybe they ran toward it and collected some of that fire. And it's also been hypothesized that they might curate the fire. Right, this is a technical term, curation of fire. And this is again from ethnoarchaeology. they tried to figure out, well, if they didn't know how to make the fire, how would they get it? They could find it in nature, but how did they keep it going? They look to living groups today who rely on primitive means of making fire, and found that most of the time they try to avoid that if they can. They try not to, because it's a huge amount of effort to make fire without modern means. Usually we're talking about making a friction fire, and everybody's heard you can rub two sticks together and make fire. It's not quite like that, but it's, that's the basic principle. We're talking about hand drills, bow drills, fire saws, and all of them concentrate the friction in the process between two pieces of wood. Right. In the example of a hand drill, and I posted an example of this, a video example of this from National Geographic too, by the way, if you're curious about how that works. A guy does it and seems to have no problem because he's in a desert and he's done it a million times and he has all the right materials. If you put him in a rainforest, you might not be able to get a fire. And that's the way that works. It's a lot of physical labor. It burns a lot of calories trying to start fires in poor conditions by using primitive means. And you can't always get one, right? So people living in those conditions today that make fire with primitive means, that's no lighters, no flint and steel, none of that stuff. They tend to curate fire, meaning once they get a fire going, they don't ever let it go out. And it could be somebody sitting by the fire and just making sure it doesn't go out. If you have somebody that can do that, that's great. But if you don't, if you're hunting and gathering, which they pretty much all are, you have to move around. And so what you'll do is you find something that's slow burning. You put it in a container that limits the oxygen that can get to it, and basically that's smoldering all day. You put a lanyard on it and hang it off your hip or whatever, and you carry around this fire with you everywhere you go. It's not an open flame. It's sort of a smoldering ember. And as long as you have that going at the end of the day, you don't have to get your bow drill out and try to start a friction fire, which might fail and could burn thousands of calories. You can just take the burning ember out and use that to light the fire like a match. So maybe Homo erectus was doing that. Excuse me. Maybe they couldn't figure out how to do friction fire. Maybe they could. The consensus is that they probably could not. The consensus is also they probably didn't have language. I take that to mean, though, that they didn't have language like we have language. They certainly didn't have all the biological adaptations in the mouth and throat to be able to make the sounds that we make. They were smarter than everything else that had existed before, but not as smart as us, so maybe they couldn't process language in the same way. It doesn't mean they didn't have some kind of complex communication system. Excuse me, they almost certainly did, although whether you call it language, that's up to the linguists. All right, because of all their adaptability, all their cultural adaptability that they developed, again, they were around for a long, long time. They were smarter than everything else that came before them. They were able to actually leave Africa. Every time there's a new human species, a member of the genus Homo or Australopithecine, anything came before, it occurs first in Africa. Right. The first migration out of Africa by any pre-human ancestor was Homo erectus. Excuse me, Australopithecines never left. Homo habilis never left. Homo erectus, because of the degree of development, its ability to adapt to environments, to controlled use of fire, better toolkit, almost certainly clothing, some kind of clothing that was manufactured probably from animal skins, and shelter. They could build shelters that were sufficient to keep them warm in cool weather. So they could move out of the tropical environment of Africa. And when they did, they moved pretty much everywhere. Right? Everywhere they could get. Let me rephrase that. They did not go to North and South America. They did not go to Australia. They did not go to Antarctica. They went to throughout Europe. They went throughout Asia, all the way through Siberia to East Asia, down into Southeast Asia. And some of the earliest examples that were found were actually found in those islands in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. So some early examples were called Java man, because they were found on the island of Java. Later on, they were found all over throughout that range. Right. So it took a while for them to figure out that all these disparate samples of fossils were actually related and from the same species. It took a while to sort that out. So that was the first migration out of Africa. All right, that is where we broke off in this particular class. So I think we didn't even get to the next slide. So I'm going to break off there, and when we resume class after the exam, I'll pick up and finish the rest of this. And I might even rewrite the whole thing for that. So all right, that's good enough. Thank you all very much, and we will stop the record.